coming up on the first hurricane landfall this season. Expected tomorrow morning as Hurricane Idalia moves through the eastern Gulf. So there it is using the Dvorak curve, and we see a large central dense overcast there starting to make out a definitive eye. So we're gradually increasing strength here. And the digital Dvorak estimates do show an increasing trend over the past 8 hours. There's the latest NHC forecast, taking the track a little bit further to the west. Earlier today, it was roughly right around here. The highest wind speed that I'm seeing on the bulletin is 100 knots, and that's a little bit lower than what we had during the morning bulletin. However, since these forecasts are only every 12 hours, those are only going to be approximations. Storm surge will be a problem up to 10 to 15 feet in that Great Bend right there of Florida. I think that's called the Big Bend. And looking for some significant rain, anywhere from 4 to 6 inches, very common along the track with isolated amounts above 6 inches. There's a look at the model performance, the GFS and the European model. This is the deterministic model output, the highest resolution model. And I've got 3 runs on here. I've got yesterday morning, yesterday evening, and this morning. The very light colors that are very hard to see, those are going to be the oldest runs. So that is yesterday morning, the European model. This is yesterday evening. That's the medium one right there. And then the newest model is the very bold blue color. And the same setup for the GFS. So the very hard to see red line right in here, that's going to be the oldest GFS. So you can see that these all reflect a westward shift, at least with the European model. The GFS kind of sticking to its guns there. And you probably remember back on Friday, the GFS was way out here, the European model was here, so they're converging on this solution. And the old NHC forecast from this morning was like that, and they've shifted that further to the west. So you can kind of see what's going on there. And here I've got a bar connecting the GFS with the European model, and that shows the position at specific times. And since this points northward towards the GFS, this shows the GFS is a little bit faster than the European model. So anyway, these are subject to change this evening with tonight's run, which will come out around midnight. And most likely what we'll see is the models converging even further, putting that landfall right in that area. If they don't, well, that's going to be a sudden change in the forecast. So we'll see what happens tonight. There's the current plots showing the hurricane west of Tampa. That looks like maybe about 200 miles offshore. The eye, of course, right there, spiral bands all the way around. And then there's the relatively rain-free alleys in between the spiral bands. And there are the leading edge spiral bands. These tend to be the more severe cells. And that area is under an SPC slight risk for this evening. And it likely will continue into tomorrow. You can see the winds are not too strong along the coast. Typically, the highest winds are very close to the center. And this is a Category 2 storm, so not all that intense. However, we take a look at the wind gusts at Tampa, gusting to 18 knots. At Venice Beach, or is that Venice? Venice Beach, 24 knots on that. And Fort Myers up to 26 knots. So that's about 30 miles an hour. And here's what it looks like on AWIPS. There's Florida right there. On AWIPS, this is basically what the forecasters at the Weather Service are seeing. And this is for 7 p.m. Eastern. So this is the latest data. And there's the storm offshore, just out of effective radar range. And there's the same data that we're seeing on that other Aviation Weather Center plot. So we'll give you a quick rundown on the storm with the 12-kilometer NAM, and you can see that storm moving north, grazing the coast near Tampa this evening, and then approaching the northern coast around daybreak. And there it is moving inland. That's going to be probably about 17Z according to this model, which is going to be about lunchtime. And you can see it moving on north into Georgia, and it will carry a wind swath pretty far inland. However, NHC going for a faster movement. This is going to be the plot for 2 in the morning. This is 2 p.m., so NHC looking for landfall right around 8 in the morning. Here's a quick look at the forecast wind gusts, and this shows that the highest winds are going to be on the east side of the storm, just east of the track. So that's the track right there, and the track of highest winds a little bit to the east right there. So yeah, it's going to be that area of the coast that will be under the gun this evening. And those winds will spread inland, damaging winds possibly all the way up to Gainesville, and the storm will continue up north and diminish as we get interaction with the land surface and friction, and of course the loss of latent heat. So that is the down low on what's happening with that storm. There it is, lurking off the bottom of the chart, 972 millibars when we did this analysis, and it's pretty close to this stationary front that kind of got hung up offshore, and north of that got northerly winds. However, the drier air, not very much of it, dew points in the upper 50s in the Ozarks, but elsewhere lots of 60s and 70s. It's that time of year. There's a lot of moisture everywhere. And with that northerly flow, we're bringing down some of that Canadian wildfire smoke. There are air quality alerts in western Minnesota and eastern and central Nebraska. In the northeastern U.S., we have flood watches for the central Appalachians, all the way from Charleston, West Virginia, up to Elkins, Altoona, State College, Pennsylvania, and Binghamton. That's due to rain and embedded storms that will persist overnight into tomorrow. In the southeastern U.S., of course, lots of precipitation in that area. Flood watches in effect from Macon all the way up to Augusta, Columbia, Raleigh-Durham, that focuses mainly on these rain bands as Hurricane Idalia comes inland. Also, we have a storm surge watch for coastal North Carolina from Morehead City up to Swan Quarter due to 2 to 4 feet inundation. That's going to be north of that circulation as the hurricane grazes North Carolina. And of course, elsewhere, needless to say, hurricane watches and warnings all through the coastal southeast. In the south-central U.S., we have red flag warnings in effect for East Texas and much of Louisiana. That's due to that dry northerly flow. They are getting a sliver of 50s dew points, and that's lowering that relative humidity down to 25%. In the southwestern U.S., excessive heat advisories once again for the lower deserts up to Lake Mead, Yuma, Lake Havasu City, Phoenix, Tucson, and Imperial, and of course into the inland areas of Los Angeles and San Diego. You can see those temperatures are well up there, 116 at Palm Springs, 114 at Phoenix, and I'm sure we're seeing lots of 100s just east of Los Angeles, so that would be Riverside, Ontario, and so on. In the northwestern U.S., we have a front making its way through much of that region. That's going to be a big influence as we get into the later part of this week. It's going to bring a lot of cold air into the Great Basin, into California, and much of the western U.S. However, we do have increased pressure gradients out there in Oregon. That's kicking up some red flag advisories due to the low relative humidities and the dry conditions. And that even affects the area along and north of Sacramento. Up there in Alaska, well, can't help noticing that wildfire smoke back once again, very thick around Fort Nelson, southern Northwest Territories, and around Peace River. Cold air coming into southern Alaska, very cool up there, 40s and 50s, and rainy conditions continue. Flood watches in effect for the interior regions. They had 2 to 4 inches over the past week, and this weekend they're going to get the remains of Tropical Storm Damri from the western Pacific. Cold air starting to show up in the Canadian high Arctic. This is much cooler than what we've seen all summer. You can see we've got 20s all the way from whatever stations those are. That's going to be west of Grise Fjord 30s around the rest of the high Arctic, and some snow around Banks Island and northern Baffin Island. Time to check in on the jet stream, and we do have a meridional pattern. Lots of waviness in the flow right there. It is shifted pretty far to the north, though, so only the northern U.S. getting any significant effects. There's a negative tilt trough there in Washington and Oregon. That's responsible for some thunderstorms in Washington and up near Vancouver. And we've got this strong northwesterly flow from the Hudson Bay region into Quebec, driving some cool air south. And tonight it's going to be in the 40s in Indiana and Michigan, and highs of the upper 60s in Cleveland, Toledo, and Detroit. It almost makes you want to move to Detroit. At least for us in Texas, those 60s do sound pretty good. All right, let's take a look at the rest of the week. Going into Wednesday and Thursday, things are progressing. Not much sign of any blocking, although we do get some of these vortices shearing off, which can lead to a blocking pattern that is almost an omega block. Not quite there, but that could be one developing there. There is that cutoff high right there offshore. So let's see what happens. We do get that cutoff low developing over California. That's partly due to that cold air sitting over that region. And it looks like as we go into early next week, I don't really see much evidence of blocking. That upper low gets picked up by the westerlies, and it's pretty much gone by 1 week from now. And as far as the ridging in the central U.S., let's check on that, because we are very concerned about the prospect of heat wave conditions. That's that subtropical ridging right there into the central Rockies and northern plains. So this area, the Corn Belt, that's going to warm up over the remainder of the week into the Labor Day weekend. So the cold air is mostly affecting the northeastern U.S. We've got a few days of very nice weather in that part of the country. Okay, so we're up at 500 millibars. This is the mid-troposphere, so we see the circulation around Idalia and Franklin. And of course, these troughs moving through the northwest and northeastern U.S. Then we go into Wednesday and Thursday and Friday. You can see that big upper high building in across the central U.S. A big increase in heat up to 98 degrees at North Platte, 97 at Goodland. And as we go into Saturday, you can see the upper high right there across Illinois. The heat gets dialed up further up to 102 at Dodge City, widespread 90s up into the Dakotas and Minnesota. And meanwhile, in Texas, we got this little upper low. So that could be a bit of a wild card for Texas, may bring some showers back. We'll have to see about that. All right, Sunday and Monday, continued ridging in the eastern U.S., heat wave continuing even as far west as Minnesota, and we get hundreds showing up in Texas, even though this trough is very close. Then going into Monday, continued warm in the central U.S., and we open up this big fetch of westerlies across much of the northwestern part of the country. The heat remains across the south and the eastern U.S. That's that big upper level high. And the last frame that we have is for next Friday morning. Continued hot through the central and southeastern U.S. And one thing that we'll have to watch out for is Idalia recurving back into Florida. I think only the GFS is showing that, but let me show you how this happens. There's the circulation going across Georgia tomorrow morning, heads off to sea. By the way, this is the 1 kilometer chart, so this is pretty much equivalent to 925 millibars over sea level areas. But there's that circulation offshore, and you can see it heading south according to the GFS, and then back into Florida around next Tuesday or Wednesday. So it kind of took a track like that. Then you can see it moving through the Gulf, but we don't see much development. That brings us up to Thursday and Friday, so grazing Texas once again. And this is a plot showing dry mid-tropospheric conditions in brown and areas of high shear in blue. Looks like a lot of dry air across the Gulf of Mexico that may impede the development of that system as if it gets out there in the Gulf. So a lot of negative influences. That's probably due to some of that continental air coming out over the coastal regions. Looks like good conditions for development out around the Caribbean and the southwestern Atlantic, but a lot of dry air. Looks like that Saharan air layer is making a couple moves out there into the tropics, and we'll have that going on much of next week. All right, and that's all we have for today. I'm going to leave you with some footage from Greg showing the Texas Hill Country and some storms that were out there around the San Antonio area. A late summer front produced these high base storms. Okay, so we'll probably see you back here on Friday. Thank you for watching and thanks for supporting the program. And we'll see you back here soon. Take care. Bye-bye.